By 2017, Vice Media was being valued at nearly $6 billion, while investors across the media industry increasingly viewed the company as one of the future winners of internet journalism and digital entertainment. Vice was not a traditional television network or newspaper company. It operated primarily as a digital-first media business, producing documentaries, online journalism, youth culture reporting, social video content, and internet-native storytelling designed specifically for younger online audiences. Its content spread aggressively across YouTube, Facebook, mobile platforms, streaming ecosystems, and social media feeds, where millions of younger viewers were increasingly consuming information instead of traditional television or print media. That made Vice extremely attractive to advertisers because large brands were struggling to keep younger consumers engaged through older media channels. The company generated revenue through advertising, branded content partnerships, sponsored media campaigns, commercial video production, licensing deals, and platform-driven audience traffic tied directly to online engagement growth. At the same time, Vice developed a reputation for producing raw documentaries, conflict reporting, underground culture coverage, and visually aggressive digital journalism that felt very different from traditional corporate media organizations. As online traffic exploded during the 2010s, Vice's audience growth accelerated rapidly across multiple social platforms simultaneously. Video views increased, social engagement surged, advertisers spent more aggressively on digital media, and investors increasingly believed internet-native media companies like Vice could eventually replace large parts of the traditional television and publishing industry. Major investors, including Disney, poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the company, while Vice aggressively expanded its studios, production operations, international offices, newsroom divisions, and digital media infrastructure globally. From the outside, the system looked extremely powerful because Vice had audience growth, cultural relevance, platform distribution, investor confidence, and rapidly expanding influence across the internet economy all at the same time. However, underneath the expansion was a fragile assumption that would later become one of the biggest problems inside the entire digital media industry. The assumption was that massive audience attention and social media traffic would eventually become a stable and highly profitable long-term business once companies became large enough. Vice's rapid expansion during the 2010s depended heavily on how the internet economy itself was changing during that period. Advertising money was rapidly moving away from traditional television, newspapers, and print publishing toward online platforms where audiences were spending increasing amounts of time every day. Companies like Facebook and YouTube aggressively prioritized video content because video kept users on their platforms longer and generated more advertising revenue through engagement and watch time. Vice fit perfectly into that environment because the company specialized in short-form documentaries, social video journalism, youth reporting, and visually aggressive digital content designed specifically for fast online consumption and sharing. As Vice's videos spread across social media feeds, audience traffic expanded rapidly without the company needing traditional television distribution systems or physical publishing infrastructure. That traffic growth became extremely important because larger audiences attracted more advertising deals, branded content partnerships, sponsorships, investor funding, and commercial media opportunities. The more engagement Vice generated online, the more investors believed the company could eventually become a dominant global digital media platform. Internally, Vice responded by hiring aggressively, expanding internationally, increasing production spending, launching new media divisions, and scaling operations as if platform-driven audience growth would continue expanding for many years. However,
Much of that growth depended on algorithms, platform distribution systems, and advertising markets that Vice itself did not fully control. This created a dangerous imbalance because the company controlled the costs of expansion but remained heavily dependent on outside technology platforms to keep delivering the audience traffic supporting that expansion. Externally, the system still looked unstoppable, but internally, the business was becoming increasingly dependent on continuous platform-driven growth simply to support the scale of the operation it had already built. As Vice continued expanding, the company increasingly operated under the assumption that digital audience growth would eventually become as economically powerful as traditional television distribution. That assumption became easier to believe because traffic numbers across the industry were exploding during the peak years of Facebook-driven media expansion. Video views surged, social engagement increased rapidly, and publishers across the internet began restructuring entire businesses around platform distribution strategies designed to maximize reach and audience scale. Vice moved aggressively into that environment because larger audiences attracted more advertising partnerships, branded content deals, sponsorship agreements, and investor optimism. The company hired heavily, expanded newsroom operations globally, increased production budgets, launched new verticals, and invested aggressively into long-form video and documentary infrastructure. However, the economics underneath that expansion were becoming increasingly fragile because digital advertising revenue was not growing at the same pace as operational costs. At the same time, much of Vice's audience growth depended on platform algorithms that could change at any moment without the company controlling those decisions directly. This created a dangerous imbalance where Vice controlled the cost structure of expansion but did not fully control the systems generating its traffic growth. The problem became even more severe because many digital media companies across the industry were simultaneously competing for the same advertising budgets while depending on the same social platforms for distribution. As more publishers flooded Facebook and YouTube with video content, the economics of digital advertising became increasingly crowded, unstable, and less profitable than many investors originally expected. Externally, Vice still looked like one of the fastest-growing media companies in the world, but internally, the business was becoming increasingly dependent on continuous audience expansion simply to support the scale of the system it had already built. The weakness inside Vice's business model became significantly more dangerous once the broader platform economy itself started changing. By the late 2010s, Facebook began adjusting how publishers and video content were distributed across its algorithm, reducing the massive traffic advantages many digital media companies had relied on during earlier expansion years. That shift immediately affected audience reach, engagement stability, advertising performance, and video growth across large portions of the digital publishing industry. For companies like Vice, the impact was severe because the business had already scaled its hiring, production costs, international expansion, and content infrastructure around assumptions of continuously expanding platform traffic. At the same time, digital advertising markets became increasingly dominated by technology giants like Google and Facebook themselves, which absorbed enormous portions of global advertising spending that publishers originally expected to capture directly. This created a structural problem across digital media because audience attention was still growing online, while sustainable publisher economics were becoming harder to maintain. Vice continued producing large-scale documentaries, international reporting, branded content, and premium video operations, but maintaining that scale required enormous ongoing spending across studios, staff, production teams, and global operations. The company attempted to offset pressure through additional partnerships, expansion initiatives, television projects, branded content operations and commercial media deals, but profitability remained difficult to stabilize consistently at the scale investors expected. At the same time, investor confidence across the digital media industry started weakening as it became increasingly clear that large online audiences alone did not automatically create durable long-term media economics. The market slowly began realizing that many internet-native media companies had built expansion strategies around traffic growth metrics that were heavily dependent on platform behavior they could not reliably control. Vice still retained cultural relevance and global visibility externally, but underneath the surface, the business was becoming increasingly trapped between slowing platform-driven growth, unstable advertising economics, and a cost structure built for a much larger future than the market was actually supporting. As platform-driven growth weakened across the industry, the size of Vice's expansion itself started becoming one of the company's biggest structural problems. The business had been built around assumptions of continuously rising traffic, expanding advertising demand, increasing branded content revenue, and long-term investor confidence in digital media growth. By that stage, Vice was operating expensive international offices, large newsroom divisions, studio operations, documentary teams, branded content infrastructure, and high-cost video production systems across multiple countries simultaneously. Those costs became increasingly difficult to sustain once digital advertising growth slowed and traffic became less predictable. At the same time, many advertisers started becoming more cautious about digital media spending because online traffic numbers alone were no longer viewed as proof of durable profitability. Investor expectations also changed significantly during this period. For years, rapid audience growth had helped justify aggressive expansion and extremely high valuations across the digital media industry. Now, investors increasingly wanted clearer profitability, stable cash flow, sustainable margins, and stronger long-term business fundamentals instead of traffic growth alone. That shift created enormous pressure on Vice because the company had scaled its operational structure for a much larger future than the underlying economics of digital publishing were realistically supporting. Layoffs, restructuring pressure, budget reductions, and operational cuts started spreading across parts of the business as management attempted to stabilize costs against slowing growth expectations. Vice still remained culturally influential and globally recognizable externally, but internally, the company was becoming trapped between declining investor optimism, unstable digital economics, rising operational pressure, and a cost structure that had become too large to support comfortably without continuous aggressive growth. By the early 2020s, the gap between Vice's public image and the underlying condition of the business had become increasingly difficult to hide. The company still carried strong cultural recognition, global brand awareness, and a reputation built during the peak years of digital media expansion, but the economics underneath the system continued weakening. Advertising markets had become more competitive, platform-driven traffic growth was far less reliable than before, and investors across the media industry were no longer funding digital expansion with the same optimism that existed during the earlier Facebook growth era. Vice attempted multiple strategies to stabilize the business, including restructuring operations, reducing costs, pursuing commercial partnerships, and expanding revenue efforts beyond pure digital advertising. However, many of those responses arrived after the company had already built a cost structure dependent on much larger and more stable future growth assumptions. At the same time, broader investor sentiment toward digital media companies continued deteriorating as several internet-native publishers across the industry struggled to convert large audiences into consistently profitable long-term businesses. Vice's valuation began collapsing from the multi-billion-dollar expectations that had previously defined the company during its peak expansion years. The business eventually entered bankruptcy proceedings in 2023 before portions of the company were acquired through a lender-led sale process that dramatically reduced the company's earlier valuation. For many investors and executives across the media industry, the collapse became a clear signal that large digital audiences alone were not enough to guarantee sustainable media economics. The underlying assumption that internet attention would automatically scale into durable long-term profitability had started breaking across large portions of the digital publishing industry. Vice did not collapse because audiences disappeared completely. It collapsed because the economics required to sustain the scale of the system never became as stable, predictable, or profitable as the growth era originally suggested.
Vice's collapse ultimately became larger than the failure of a single media company because it exposed a much deeper weakness underneath the economics of the modern internet media industry. For years, investors across digital publishing believed that audience attention, platform reach, social engagement, and traffic scale would eventually evolve into stable long-term profitability once companies became large enough. Vice became one of the clearest symbols of that belief because the company successfully built massive global attention, cultural influence, and digital reach during the peak years of platform-driven media expansion. However, the collapse demonstrated that audience scale alone was never enough to guarantee durable media economics. The platforms distributing the traffic controlled the algorithms. The technology giants absorbed enormous portions of digital advertising revenue, and publishers competing for the same online attention increasingly struggled to build stable profit structures underneath rapidly growing operational costs. Vice expanded aggressively because the system initially rewarded audience growth above almost everything else. The problem was that the underlying economics supporting that growth remained unstable long after the expansion had already happened. By the time investors across the industry fully recognized the weakness in the model, many digital media companies had already built cost structures dependent on traffic growth that was becoming harder to sustain reliably. Vice still exists today in a much smaller form than the multi-billion-dollar media empire investors once imagined during its peak expansion years. But the collapse permanently changed how investors, publishers, and executives across the media industry viewed digital audience growth as a business model. The story was never simply about Vice making bad decisions. It was about an entire generation of internet media companies discovering that controlling audience attention was far easier than building a stable long-term business underneath it.